I want to talk a little bit about oil as the driver of economic growth in Russia. I want to talk a little bit about institutions and development, which is really the key for economic growth and development when you ask most economists, and how that is related to what we have actually seen in Russia and the other transition countries. As you know, the institute is called the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics. So that's perhaps the first thing to just mention. Transition was, the term in economics was coined when the Soviet Union was dissolved and a planned system, a communist planned system, was going to be transformed into a market economy. That's the origin of transition economics in our profession. Then, of course, as we can see today, we had the Brexit discussion. We have transition in so many different places, in so many parts of the world. And I think it's safe to say that every country is in a constant mode of transition. But just so you know where the term comes from in sort of the economics profession, it's really going from a planned economy to a market economy. So I'll mention a little bit about this. And we'll talk about some other dimension. I mean, economists are usually blamed for being a little bit square. We only think about sort of income and growth and nothing else. That is sort of true, but it's also the fact that economists, at least the last 10 or 15 years, think about happiness and what people actually want to achieve in their lives, and have added that to our basic analysis and understanding. And I'll show you a few other transition indicators that I think are particularly relevant for Russia and some of the other countries in the region. All right. So if you want one chart for the full sort of discussion of economics transition in Russia, this would be the chart. This is GDP per capita relative to the EU countries, the original 15 EU countries. So on the y-axis, it basically tells you the average person living in Russia in 1990, which is the start of this chart, enjoyed about 70% of the income that the average person had in sort of the old EU countries. So that's the starting point. The red line here is Russian Federation. Okay? We also have, as a comparison, a few other countries that we think of as transition countries. The top line, the light blue line, is the Czech Republic. The little bit darker blue line is the 10 countries that joined the EU, that were sort of transition countries that came out of Eastern Europe but joined the EU. So think about Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and all of these countries. 10 of them joined the EU in 2004 and 2007. Then further below, we have the former Soviet Union countries. The black line are the set of countries that have oil and minerals and export them to a large extent. So that would be Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan. These are the natural resource exporting countries. And the lowest line here, the light green or whatever the color is on the screen, are the other former Soviet Union countries that do not really have natural resources. So already here, it is quite striking to see how much the initial decline was in this early phase of transition. You can see for Russia, income compared to the EU went from being 70% to being only 35% of EU incomes in that initial collapse. And of course, this is an extremely important background for anyone who thinks about politics and the drivers of politics, I think, still today in Russia. That initial collapse was not a particularly happy period for someone living in Russia and trying to make a decent living in Russia. I think anyone would agree with that. And we can also see that the turning point is about the time when your current president became president for the first time. So around 1999, 2000, I mean, you had the big crisis in 98. The IMF came there with some suggestions on how to fix the economy. The ruble was depreciated, and then in 2000, 2001, oil prices started to increase. So you have a very significant increase from that time period in Russia, and incomes at the end here peaks at around 60% of EU incomes, and then fell back a bit again due to the more recent crisis years in Russia. But anyway, I think this is extremely important in also understanding the narratives as we were discussing before. I mean, the narrative of chaos and not so good lives during the early phases of transition versus the idea of having a stable leader that really fills the fridge in that later part of this chart. And I mean, as a comparison, you can see that the EU, the countries that enter the EU are basically at the end of this period at a similar level to Russia in terms of income per person. But they actually started out being 20 percentage points below Russia in the early days. So, you know, the other thing, of course, is that here, having minerals and oil and natural resources is definitely better than being the bar at the line at the end here, which is the countries that do not have that. And we'll come back to that discussion in a moment. Just as a little bit of a side note, this chart is basically just having lines, the same countries that you saw in the previous chart, with the only difference that the red line here is all of the Soviet Union countries, not Russia itself, but all of them. And this is just a chart showing you where the different country groups fall in the World Bank's income classification scheme. So if you're at the top of this chart, if you're a 4, you're classified as a high income country. If you go down, you're an upper middle income country, a low middle income country, and then if you're down at 1, you're a low income country. And we can see there has been quite a lot of progress made since that initial very, very significant drop. And what is important if you're doing development economics more generally, we don't see what economists usually call a low income trap or a middle income trap. It actually looks like these countries, since 2000, have been moving up the country income rankings quite significantly and at a steady rate. If you sort of summarize this a little bit in numbers, just to get a sense of how important that initial decline was, is that for Russia as a country, you basically lost half of our GDP. 43% of Russian GDP disappeared in those first years. And it basically took 8 years of decline before hitting the bottom and then getting back. And maybe even more importantly, it took 16 years to get back to where you started. We can have all sorts of discussion about the fact that initial GDP in Russia was probably overstated and it hasn't been measured properly along the way and so on and so forth. But I think it's extremely important to understand. I don't know how many of you were actually remember sort of the whole transition initial phases. Everyone is old enough to sort of have a memory of the Soviet Union and the mess in transition. I remember it, but I looked at it from a distance, you know, so I didn't have to live through it. I know that some people here in the front row may have actually lived through it at least. So. but anyway, I just think it is important to understand pretty basic economics in terms of how it shapes the mind of people, how they think about their leadership, how they think about things like reforms and liberal democracy and all sorts of things that unfortunately coincided with exactly this drop of 43% of GDP. I mean, that's something that people definitely remember if they have lived through it. So, okay, that was sort of the initial drama, I would say, in Russian GDP and also in the region. Then we have a pretty common question, which is, would Russia have been better out without the oil? Would Russia as a country have a higher GDP today if it didn't have oil? Because a lot of economists talk about something called the resource curse, which basically says if you have natural resources, you're just going to fight over the rents that come with natural resources, and that will basically prevent growth. These charts are basically comparing Russia with both BRIC countries, you know, Brazil, India, China, as well as some other transition countries, sort of Lithuania and Poland here. And the red line here is basically the Russian GDP number, and the others are what would Russia have looked like if they had a growth experience like these other countries. And we can basically see that Russia would not have been better without its oil and growing according to Lithuania or Poland over this time period. This is a little bit problematic because even if oil then comes with a lot of income, it also comes with a lot of uncertainty. So the problem with Russian GDP growth is that it's really not based on sort of ideas, innovation, entrepreneurship, increasing efficiency in the public sector, etc., etc., etc. Most of the GDP growth we can see at sort of the macro level, the whole economy level, comes from the simple fact that for a very long time period, oil prices were increasing at very high and steady rates. And every time they didn't increase by a high and steady rate, it also meant that GDP dropped. So the top chart here is basically, the black line is oil prices, and the red bars is GDP per capita in Russia. And if you're sort of economist nerds, you can actually run a regression trying to see how much of Russia's GDP growth can I explain with only one variable, which is international oil prices, or rather changes in international oil prices. And it turns out that you can explain at least 2/3 of Russia's GDP growth for the last sort of 20 years by just one variable. And if you try to make forecasts of Russian GDP, you're going to make mistakes all the time, which is what this little chart to the left says, because it's very hard to predict oil prices. So if you have this strong correlation in the background, you try to make predictions, and you can't really predict oil prices because no one can predict oil prices. It means that being the Minister of Finance or being the central bank governor in Russia is actually a very difficult job. It's very hard to predict GDP. It's very hard to predict government revenues. It's very hard to understand how to deal with the exchange rate. So the oil wealth certainly produces wealth, but it also produces a lot of uncertainty. So that's the issue. And of course, in the most recent episode, 2014, you know what happened. Oil prices, that's the black line here, and the green line is the ruble exchange rate to the dollar. This time, the Russian central bank and government realized pretty soon that you had to let the ruble depreciate very, very significantly to deal with this massive decline in oil prices. So if you see the red line on top, that's basically the oil price, but in ruble instead of dollars. So you see that becomes much more stable because you let the exchange rate depreciate in line with oil price declines. So when people also have this narrative about the central bank and they're screwing up the economy, it's making us poor, as an economist, I would say this is the perfect macroeconomic policy from the Russian central bank. If they had not done that, your economy would have been in much worse shape today than what it is, thanks to this single policy by the government, which is an exchange rate adjustment. But again, it comes with its own narrative. A lot of people remember that having a stable exchange rate, that was really the foundation of economic prosperity in this transition period. And of course, there were a lot of voices raised when the exchange rate behaved like this. But I think it was a very good policy. Your president then has the challenge to figure out how should he deal with oil and the oil dependence. I don't really envy his task here because on the one hand, he knows, of course, that the economy is heavily dependent on oil. At the same time, a lot of the rest of the world is talking about getting rid of hydrocarbons and moving to the green economy. Once that happens, of course, the price of oil goes to zero. That would be a disaster for the Russian economy. Let's not pretend anything else. But at this point, your government really has to figure out what is the plan. How long is that transition going to be from the oil-based economy to the green economy? Because that's basically the time period you have to reorient the whole economy of Russia. So anyone who tells you that we can keep doing this because now oil prices came up a little bit again is right, but only in the very short run. I would say that when my kids have grown up, I think we have come quite a long way towards the green economy, and I think that the oil price by then will be very close to zero. So again, you should all be pushing your politicians for what is the strategy to get out of this oil dependence, and you really need to start doing it now. Because, it's going to be 25 years maybe, but then that's it with oil for Russia, I think. I'm not going to babble too long, but I want to say that Russia is, of course, not only important in its own right. Your economy is, of course, extremely important for a lot of the other countries in the region. This chart just shows you how much exports and how much workers' remittances these other countries derive from trading and working in Russia. Trading with Russia and working in Russia. So you see, Tajikistan, there are so many people going to work in Russia from Tajikistan that the money that they send back home accounts for 35% of their GDP. Okay, that's a very large number. We can see that a country like Belarus, at least in the official statistics, they're not sending back so much remittances, but they trade a lot with Russia. So almost 20% of their GDP comes from trading with Russia. Again, extremely concentrated and very dependent on the economic fortunes of Russia as well. And if you want to see what happens then with exports and remittances when Russian GDP goes up and down, this is the chart for that. So Russian GDP here is the red line, and then the green line is what happens to export and remittances for the other countries in the region. And you can see it's almost a perfect fit. So you basically have the responsibility not only for your own economy and your own well-being, you're also heavily responsible for the well-being of all the other guys in the countries I just showed you. So, you know, externalities, as it's called in economics. Russia is much more important than just Russia itself, as we all know, of course. What would be sort of the economist recipe for an economy without oil? What can you do instead of oil? This is a chart showing you what is it worth to have different types of assets for a country. Okay, so in the left panel here, we have all the oil and minerals and gas and all that stuff. So if the Norwegians pulled out all the oil they have, and they gave people in Norway all the money they get from selling that, each Norwegian person would get $80,000. Not so bad. Unfortunately, I'm Swedish, I'm not Norwegian. Our bar you can't even see down there. Too bad. Some of you at least are from Russia, quite a few of you are from Russia. You have about $25,000 worth of oil and minerals in the ground, according to this calculation. Not so bad, I'm a bit envious there. But the thing is that if you want to build a modern economy that can grow sustainably even when we change to an oil-free and carbon-free economy, you really need something else to drive your growth. And the other side of this chart is what sort of economists and others call intangible wealth. And that's basically the value of patents, ideas, research, institution, human capital, sort of all of the other fluffy stuff that goes into creating Google or Facebook or Spotify or what have you. And to make sure that people trust their governments not to steal their inventions once they're there or steal their companies when they become very profitable. So all of these things also have a value that we can compute. If you look at that for a country like Norway, they are again pretty lucky. That is actually worth $500,000. So even for Norway, that we all think of as an oil nation, the intangible capital is worth six times as much as their oil wealth. I mean, Sweden is also there around $500,000. What is not so happy for people in Russia, of course, is that the estimate for Russia of intangible wealth is basically at the same level as your subsoil wealth, around $20,000. You know? So you can either think of this as a huge problem for Russia, which is usually how we focus the discussions. But I can also say this could be the future of Russia. This is where you can really, really improve, okay? This is really an area where you have a lot of economic growth ahead of you if you think about how can we improve intangible wealth. And in most economics discussions, this intangible wealth comes from human capital and institutions, etc. So if you just want to compare, since I'm a little bit nationalistic here, I'm using the Swedish and Russian flags to indicate how we actually score in terms of some institutional measures that we think are important. This is also the World Bank that put together these things. So we have three institutions that we think are very important for growth: government efficiency, rule of law, and the ability to control corruption. These are all seen as sort of fundamental institutions that will create the environment for people to innovate, make businesses, be productive, have property rights and all of that. So as you can see, Russia has a little bit of a way to go here in terms of improving these institutions. I wouldn't think of Sweden being the perfect example, But I can't see any reason fundamentally why people in this room couldn't build institutions in Russia the way we have built institutions in Sweden. There's no fundamental sort of reason why that couldn't happen. But of course, this is something the people of Russia has to demand of the Russian leadership. That's how institutions are built, basically. It is interesting, this idea that institutions are really important for growth comes from a very long and solid sort of literature in economics about development. However, when I looked into this with my co-author exactly for the transition time period that I showed you before, it's actually very hard to see any strong correlations. We have 25 transition countries in this paper I'm talking about, and it's very hard to say that the transition countries with good institutions are the ones that perform really well. Unfortunately, for such relatively short time period with relatively few observations, it's actually not so hard to prove that institutions have been important. It is true, though, that the very massive decline in GDP that we saw initially, that is correlated with poor institutions. So in some sense, institutions is not only a way of growing, it's actually a way of protecting you from going down. And this is, of course, also important when we think of a country that is so dependent on sort of natural resources and international prices. You need the institutions to actually deal with the crisis that you may face in the future in this area. Okay, I told you that we don't only think about money and income. We have a few other things on our list. These are some of the dimensions of transition that we can think about, and also some of the very important dimensions that people find that increase well-being of a regular citizen. So people obviously don't care only about how much money they have in their wallets, they care about a lot of other things like this. So what happened then? Well, let's start with income still, and I'm going to explain in 1 minute how these charts work. So we basically take the 10 EU countries that went, the 10 countries that were transition countries and entered the EU, and I put in this chart the best performing country in that group, in that top line, and I put the worst performing country in that group in the bottom blue line, okay? Then we do the same exercise for the CIS countries, and this is basically what happened. Finally, I also put where is Russia at the end of this chart, and that's the label you see. So Russia went from having GDP per capita of about $10,000 to GDP per capita of about $23,000 in PPP terms. That's still some ways behind the top EU country. It's definitely higher than the worst EU country, and it's sort of at the top of the CIS list together with Kazakhstan. Okay, so that's income. We talked about income. Well, people also care about how long they can live, how long their children can live. And this is what has happened to life expectancy at birth. Also here we can see progress in all of these sort of top and bottom categories. We have had improvements in terms of life expectancy at birth. Here Russia is not actually the leading CIS country. I mean, you had some improvements over this time period, but a life expectancy of 70 years here is not really the top of the list. So there's room for improvement, but you know, it has gone up in Russia over these last couple of years. Okay, so these were the good stories. What happens when we turn to civil liberties? This is civil liberties as measured by Freedom House. If you're scoring 1, you're at the top of their list, Freedom House list, in terms of civil liberties. again, you see a very strong increase for the 10 countries that joined the EU. You also see convergence at the end, so they are getting more and more similar in this respect. Unfortunately for the CIS countries, both the top and the bottom have actually declined a bit, and they have become even sort of more dispersed than they were initially. And for Russia, I'm sorry to say that the ranking has gone from 3, which is sort of solid, to 6, which is not so great in this regard. And this was 2015. I didn't add the latest number for this. Similarly, for political rights, we have almost the identical picture with this convergence and improvements in the EU 10 countries and very significant decline in the CIS countries. Again, with Russia going from a ranking of 3 to a ranking of 6. And this is something that most people would agree affects how people feel about their lives and their possibilities in life, I would say. Well, I think we have got the picture by now that transition is not just about income. And I think we can safely say that transition has been quite successful along the income dimension, but it has not been so fantastic in terms of some of these other institutional indicators. But for the average transition countries, out of these 25 countries that we have looked at, it was certainly not better before. So, I mean, transition has not been straightforward and easy in all dimensions, but if you were the average transition countries, you are actually better off today than you were before. And I want to add that being part of the EU now is also correlated very strongly with very good outcomes. And this is one of the success stories that we fail to tell in a very consistent manner. There's a lot of discussions about what is wrong with the EU, all the problems now with Poland and Hungary and how they make a mess out of things. But we sort of lose track of the fact of all of the progress that these 10 countries have made since they joined the EU. And I think we have no clue what would have happened in terms of migration, social problems, all these other issues right at our borders if they had not been integrated into the EU. So I think that's extremely important to remember, and somehow it always gets lost when people talk about the EU nowadays. Russia in some, well, you know Russia better than I do, but I think in terms of institutions, civil liberties and political rights, Russia has quite a long way to go, and I'm sorry to say that that road has become longer over these 25 years in transition and not shorter. But maybe the next 25 years of the school will change that picture. So, thank you.